Before we trace what actually goes on beneath the surface, one honest note worth stating plainly: no one has literal access to another person's private thoughts. What we're actually tracing today is something considerably more reliable than mind reading. The consistent psychological patterns this entire series has established across dozens of previous conversations. Patterns reliable enough to reveal, with genuine confidence, exactly what narcissistic psychology actually thinks about the people in its orbit, even when he'd never consciously articulate any of it this directly. Let's start with the first, most fundamental thing worth understanding. He thinks of you primarily as a resource, categorized by function rather than by who you actually are. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about attention versus love, about how heavily his psychological stability depends on external material his own internal architecture cannot generate independently. Beneath the surface, beneath whatever affectionate language gets used, you exist in his internal world primarily according to what you provide: validation, regulation, admiration, a stable audience for whatever version of himself needs reflecting back. This isn't necessarily conscious, calculated thought in the way it might sound stated this directly. It's closer to instinctive categorization, the same way you might unconsciously categorize a comfortable chair by its function without consciously articulating: this exists to support my weight every time you sit in it. He genuinely believes, at some level, that you're lucky to have him, even while simultaneously, privately, sensing this isn't actually true. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the specific fragility underlying grandiose self-presentation. This belief coexists uncomfortably with genuine unresolved insecurities, producing exactly the kind of contradictory internal experience that explains why his behavior often seems so inconsistent. Confident and dismissive one moment, anxiously seeking reassurance the next. Both beliefs exist simultaneously, in genuine tension, without his psychology having developed the capacity to resolve this contradiction into anything coherent. He thinks about your reactions more than he thinks about your actual, inner experience. Connecting to everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how his attention orients toward producing and monitoring specific responses rather than genuine curiosity about your internal world. Beneath the surface, considerable mental energy gets devoted to predicting and managing how you'll react to specific behaviors. Considerably less energy gets devoted to genuine curiosity about what you actually think, feel, or need independent of how it affects his own experience. He secretly, quietly measures himself against you, even when his outward behavior suggests dismissiveness or superiority. Remember everything we've traced throughout our conversation about comparison anxiety and the specific quality of insecurity that persists beneath grandiose presentation. Whatever genuine qualities you possess, your competence, your relationships, your independent success, register beneath the surface as a private, uncomfortable measurement he's constantly, unconsciously conducting, regardless of how dismissive he might appear on the surface, toward exactly these same qualities. He thinks, at some level, that your eventual departure is inevitable, long before it actually happens. Connecting to something we've traced throughout multiple previous conversations about the underlying insecurity that drives so much preemptive, self-protective behavior. This anticipation, however unconscious, often drives considerable behavior that might otherwise seem confusing. The testing, the subtle sabotage of your independent happiness, the preemptive devaluation that sometimes precedes genuine crisis. Beneath the surface, a persistent, low, great expectation of eventual abandonment shapes considerably more of his behavior than his outward confidence would ever suggest. Let's continue tracing what genuinely, reliably operates beneath the surface, moving into territory that reveals something about the specific emotional texture underlying his relationship with you, distinct from the more general patterns we traced throughout Part 1. He genuinely resents you for making him feel anything he cannot fully control. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how thoroughly his psychological stability depends on maintaining control over his own internal experience, avoiding exactly the kind of genuine vulnerability that authentic connection inevitably requires. Beneath the surface, any moment where you produced a feeling he couldn't immediately manage or dismiss, genuine tenderness, genuine longing, genuine fear of losing you, registers not as evidence of connection, but as a kind of vulnerability he experiences with quiet, unspoken resentment. This explains something we've traced throughout multiple previous conversations: why moments of apparent closeness often preceded sudden withdrawal or sudden coldness. The closeness itself, precisely because it produced feeling he couldn't fully control, activated resentment his conscious mind likely never fully articulated. He believes somewhere beneath the surface that everyone eventually leaves, and this belief shapes how he treats you long before any actual departure occurs. Connecting to everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the early wounding that typically produces narcissistic psychological structure. Beneath whatever confidence gets displayed on the surface, a genuine foundational expectation of eventual abandonment often drives considerable behavior. The testing that seems designed to provoke exactly the departure he claims to fear. The preemptive devaluation that protects him from the vulnerability of genuinely hoping you'll stay. This isn't conscious sabotage in any deliberate sense. It's closer to a self-fulfilling prophecy his psychology cannot help but enact, protecting itself from an anticipated pain by ensuring through its own behavior that this pain eventually, predictably arrives. He thinks your empathy is simultaneously his greatest resource and something he genuinely, quietly cannot fully understand or trust. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how narcissistic psychology depends on, but cannot genuinely replicate the emotional depth an empath naturally provides. Beneath the surface, your capacity for genuine compassion, genuine forgiveness, genuine emotional generosity registers simultaneously as something he desperately needs and something he cannot fully comprehend, precisely because his own psychological architecture never developed the capacity to generate this same quality internally. This produces a genuine, quiet bewilderment beneath the surface. A sense that you're operating according to some emotional logic he can benefit from without ever genuinely understanding. He secretly believes that if you truly, fully saw him, you would leave, and this belief drives considerable effort toward preventing exactly this kind of complete, genuine seeing. Connecting to everything we've traced throughout this entire series about performance and image management. Beneath whatever confidence gets displayed, genuine fear of complete exposure drives considerable behavior. The careful narrative management, the resistance to genuine vulnerability, the discomfort that surfaces whenever you demonstrate the kind of accurate perception this entire series has traced extensively regarding super empaths specifically. This fear isn't necessarily accompanied by conscious awareness of its own existence. It manifests instead as discomfort, as defensiveness, as the specific quality of resistance he displays whenever genuine intimacy threatens to reveal more than his psychology can tolerate being seen. He thinks about what you provide him considerably more often, and with considerably more genuine attention, than he thinks about what he provides you. Remember everything we've traced throughout our conversation about why narcissists need attention more than love. Beneath the surface, considerable mental accounting occurs regarding exactly what supply, exactly what validation, exactly what regulation you're currently providing, alongside considerably less genuine reflection on whether he's offering anything resembling equivalent depth or equivalent care in return. This isn't necessarily conscious, deliberate calculation in the way it might sound describe this directly. It's closer to an automatic, background monitoring systems, constantly assessing his own supply levels without corresponding awareness of the imbalance this assessment reveals. Here's something crucial worth understanding about why all of these patterns, taken together, reveal something considerably more coherent than a random collection of unrelated thoughts. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the underlying structure connecting every specific manifestation of narcissistic behavior we've examined across dozens of previous conversations. What's actually operating beneath the surface isn't malice in the straightforward, deliberate sense many people initially imagine. It's something considerably more complicated, a genuine, structural incapacity for the kind of stable, secure internal experience that would allow him to simply, comfortably experience connection without this constant, background calculation, this constant management of vulnerability, this constant, unconscious monitoring of exactly what he's receiving versus what he's genuinely capable of offering in return. Here's what's worth understanding about why this pattern remains remarkably consistent regardless of which specific narcissist you might be considering. Connecting to everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the structural, rather than individual, nature of these patterns. These aren't unique, personal thoughts specific to whoever you're currently thinking about while listening to today's conversation. They represent the predictable, structural output of a particular psychological architecture, one this entire series has traced extensively across dozens of conversations as producing remarkably consistent patterns regardless of the specific individual displaying them. Because here's what all of this ultimately needs to lead toward. And it's worth being direct about it rather than leaving this conversation as simply an inventory of his private, internal experience without addressing what genuinely matters most, what this understanding actually means for you, and how to hold it in a way that serves your healing rather than becoming another source of exhausting analysis directed at someone who no longer requires your continued attention. The first thing worth understanding clearly is something worth naming directly, connecting to a tension worth examining honestly. Everything we've traced throughout today's conversation, however accurate and however genuinely revealing, describes a psychological architecture that was never actually about you specifically. Remember, everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how these patterns operate independent of your own individual qualities, your own individual worth, your own individual behavior. The resentment toward feelings he couldn't control, the belief that everyone eventually leaves, the constant background monitoring of supply. None of this developed because of anything specific to who you actually are. It developed long before you entered his life, shaped by his own early experience. And it would have operated according to this same essential structure, with almost anyone he happened to become significantly involved with. Here's the second thing worth understanding. It's one that offers something genuinely important to carry forward from this entire conversation. If understanding what operates beneath his surface produces genuine compassion in you, a recognition of the genuine psychological limitation and genuine, unresolved suffering underlying all of this, that compassion is legitimate and worth honoring without requiring it to translate into continued relationship or continued proximity. Remember, everything we've traced throughout this entire series about holding genuine, complicated human feeling without that feeling obligating any particular response. You can understand and even feel genuine sadness about the psychological architecture we've traced throughout today's discussion, while simultaneously maintaining complete, unwavering clarity that this understanding doesn't require you to remain available to absorb its ongoing effects. Here's the third thing worth understanding, one that circles back to something we've emphasized throughout this entire series in countless different forms. Whatever he genuinely, secretly thinks about you was never actually the thing your own worth needed to depend on. Remember, everything we've traced throughout this entire series about rebuilding self-trust independent of external validation. His internal categorization of you as resource rather than person, his resentment toward feelings he couldn't control, his constant background monitoring of what you provide versus what he offers in return. None of this reflects anything true about who you actually are. It reflects, entirely and completely, the limitations of his own psychological architecture. Limitations that would have produced this same internal experience regardless of which specific person he happened to be thinking about. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about why this understanding proves genuinely valuable despite its inherently speculative nature, given the honest caveat we opened this conversation with. Remember, everything we've traced throughout this entire series about pattern recognition serving as permanent, protective wisdom. Even though we cannot claim literal access to any single individual's private thoughts, understanding the reliable, structural patterns this entire series has traced across dozens of previous conversations protects you considerably, regardless of whether every specific detail matches precisely what any particular narcissist happens to privately think. The genuine value lies in recognizing the underlying mechanism, resentment toward uncontrolled vulnerability, structural incapacity for genuine reciprocity, the constant background monitoring this entire pattern produces, rather than in claiming perfect, literal certainty about any individual's exact internal experiences. Here's the fifth and final thing worth understanding, the piece that ultimately matters most as we close this entire conversation. If everything we've traced throughout today's discussion genuinely, accurately describes what operates beneath the surface, this doesn't require you to keep analyzing it, keep understanding it more deeply. Keep tracking whether it matches your own specific experience with genuine precision. Remember, everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the difference between useful, protective understanding and exhausting, ongoing preoccupation that keeps you oriented around someone whose internal experience no longer requires your continued attention. You now understand with considerable clarity what typically operates beneath narcissistic presentation. The resentment, the fear of abandonment, the structural incapacity for genuine reciprocity, the constant unconscious monitoring of supplies. This understanding serves you by dismantling any lingering confusion about behavior that once seemed genuinely bewildering. By protecting you from ever again mistaking these patterns for something they were never actually capable of being. It doesn't require you to keep applying this understanding specifically to him. Keep wondering exactly what he currently, privately thinks. Keep analyzing every remaining piece of information that might confirm or complicate everything we've traced throughout this entire discussion. What he secretly thinks, insofar as we can ever genuinely know it, was never actually the thing that determined your worth, your capacity for genuine connection, or your own continued, genuine flourishing. That worth, that capacity, that flourishing belongs entirely to you, built through your own life, your own relationships, your own genuine character. Verified across every context and every person who's ever actually taken the time to know you accurately. his internal world, whatever it genuinely contains, remains his own separate territory now, one that no longer requires your continued exploration in order for your own life to continue moving forward, fully and completely, into whatever comes next. There's one final truth worth carrying forward from everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation, and it deserves to be the last thing you hold on to rather than anything about his internal world at all. You spent considerable time trying to understand him, his moods, his contradictions, his hidden thoughts, his unspoken fears. This understanding may have felt necessary once, even survival critical, a way of predicting danger before it arrived, a way of making sense of behavior that otherwise felt genuinely incomprehensible. That effort was real, and it deserves acknowledgement rather than dismissal. It's because it likely helped you navigate something genuinely difficult for as long as you needed to navigate it. But here's what deserves to be true from this point forward. You no longer owe him this level of understanding. You've spent enough time inside his psychology. You've traced enough of his patterns, decoded enough of his contradictions, understood enough of what drives his behavior beneath the surface. That work is finished now, not because every question has been answered with perfect certainty, but because you've reached the point where further understanding of him yields diminishing returns for your own life. What deserves your attention now is a different kind of understanding entirely. Not what he secretly thinks about you, but what you actually think about yourself. It's verified through your own experience rather than filtered through his distorted lens. Not what drives his contradictions, but what genuinely brings you peace. Not the architecture of his psychological limitations, but the architecture of the life you're now free to build, entirely on your own terms, without needing his internal world to make sense before you're allowed to move forward. Here's the truth this entire conversation has ultimately been building toward. He secretly thinks many things about you. Resource threat, comparison, something he needs but cannot fully trust. None of it was ever accurate, because none of it was ever actually about you. It was always about the limitations of his own mind, projected outward onto whoever happened to stand close enough to receive it. So you happen to be standing there. That's the whole story. Not a verdict on your worth. Not a mystery requiring your continued solving. Simply the unfortunate proximity of someone whole to someone who was never able to be. You are not required to keep understanding him in order to keep healing. The two were never actually connected the way it might have felt while you were still inside it. Your healing lives entirely on your own side of this story, now. In your own thoughts about yourself, your own peace. Your own life continuing to unfold in directions that have nothing to do with decoding a mind that was never capable of holding you accurately in the first place. Let him keep whatever he secretly thinks. It was never yours to carry, and it was certainly never true. What's true is considerably simpler, considerably more solid, and entirely, finally, within your own hands. You are worthy. You are whole, and you were never, for a single moment, anything less than exactly what he could never fully see. That not seeing was always his limitation. Never your reflection.